Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all well and staying safe. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Lalitesh. He's a pioneer in crowdsourcing. His creation, Google Map Maker, tripled the world's map courses, mapping 3 billion people in 187 countries. His startup was Google's first acquisition in 2002. He brought Google to India, co-founding its first international engineering center. He retired as its head of India products and to build products for the underserved. He has since architected India's Open API, AP's Fiber Grid, and founded Indihood. He founded CMU's Lunar Rover project in 1993. He received a PhD and master's from CMU in robotics and computer science, MS from design in Stanford, MS in aerospace in Iowa State, and BTech from IIT Mumbai. He's always been very passionate about building something that solves problems and building technology that impacts at scale. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lalitesh. Dr. Lalitesh, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Lakshmi. for the long and generous introduction. Although I will say that we are still IIT Bombay. It's not IIT Mumbai yet, but your husband, who is a very close friend of mine, Bharadwaj, would know that. We were classmates. Um, so I have called this um, presentation the Inclusion Yajna. Those of you who work with the government know that the Indian government calls serving of making sure that all 1.35 billion people in India are well served and taken care of, inclusion, right? Um, but as we all know, that has never happened, and of course the government is aware, and we are all aware. And the question is, can we do something about this as technologists and digital pioneers? And the answer turns out, and it turns out that we can. But before we go there, let's look at India, right? So if you talk to people about India, both in boardrooms as well as in policy rooms, you will see some image like this, right? We are building amazing infrastructure, both business wise and physical infrastructure, and we are a 2.3 trillion dollar economy. And even after this pandemic, the IMF says that we will be growing 8% year over year after that, right? So, and not a surprise, it's a preferred destination for MNCs and the toast of the investment industry. But there is another India that nobody really talks about. We have occasional stories, but that is not the mainstream conversation we have on a daily basis. So let me give you a few statistics, because there are always sad stories, but the question is this a real problem? So there are 750 million people who have one meal a day. And 230 million people are going through deep starvation, right? There are actually entire districts in Orissa where if you go there, it will look like the ancient images, well, not ancient, but older images of Ethiopia, where everybody's stomach is distended with kwashiorkor, right? And we lose 2.5 million lives just to hunger alone, right? And it's not that the life of the upper middle class is that great either. 60% of our engineers are unemployed, and more than 55% are unemployable. And this is according to the Confederation of Indian Industry. This is not a stat by some think tank. And 250 million people are unemployed, and we are adding about 7 to 10 million people in this country to the unemployed list every year because of our growth rate. Right. So the question is, is there anything that is possible? Is there anything that is possible to solve this problem? And can any amount of growth overcome this deficit in inclusion that we have? And this is a very obvious picture. And if you actually take a drone image of the Cisco campus, it will look like this, right? On one side, we will have these amazingly well-designed and well-built, very productive environments. And on the other side, you have still a very productive environment, but the people there, don't have a lot to live by and don't have a lot of things going for them, right? And let me touch on, where we are today. One of the things I kept hearing, and Krishnan mentioned this before we began, that one of the issues that we have across Bangalore and probably across India is that there are a lot of people feeling, slightly off their mooring. Many of you sitting at home might be slightly disturbed by being at home for so long, and not having, the ability you had to mix with your colleagues, mix with your friends, go out and do things. And we all of us have had a lot to give up in the last few months. And those of us who are parents are troubled by what we see with our kids. So, we are calling there is a mental health problem. Well, I'm hoping this slide will help you, have a different perspective. About the estimate is that more than 100 million workers walked home mostly from South India all the way to the north of India. We have GPS trails and phone logs that tell us that there are people who walked from Mumbai all the way to the Indo-Gangetic plain in Bihar and West Bengal, right? And one story that struck me, because my parents are from Hyderabad, is there is this 12-year-old girl who walked from Telangana and almost made it home to Chhattisgarh and lost her life a few kilometers from her home, right? And when I look at stories like that, the what I'm going through and what my kids are going through pales in comparison. And that also gives me personally purpose in what is left to be done and what we need to do to help. And so that is the problem. What is the solution? I'm I'll be the first to say that I don't know the solution. I'm seeing glimmers of the problem. I'm beginning to understand the problem, so I will do my best to convey my understanding of the problem. And there are one or two mild successes I had. I'll walk you through those successes and see what else, what I have learned from that, and extrapolate wildly. And you can take it with a grain of salt, if not a bag of salt. One problem that is very clear is that the very notion that began your company, Cisco, internet, is still not ubiquitous for these billion people. And I don't mean they don't have 4G access. I mean, even if they have 4G access, their internet is dark. And this dark knowledge of them and about them that still keeps them oppressed, I think is one of the root causes of poverty. And I like to call poverty a information problem, where every root cause of poverty that I have researched boils down to a missing information system, right? And in many ways, the internet does not work for more than a billion people for a very simple reason. Of the 1.35 billion people in India, and you can extrapolate this to all 7.8 billion of us on the planet. Of the 1.35 billion people, 90% of India's disposable income is in the hands of less than 80 million of us, right? And everybody I'm talking to belongs to that 80 million. And the other 10% is in the hands of what we call India's middle class, which is another 150 to 100 million. All of our maids, drivers, and so on belong to that middle class, where they have a little disposable income, but very little. And then you have a billion people who have no disposable income, and whatever income they have goes into daily subsistence. And most of those purchasing decisions, if any, are made by the government in the form of price fixing and subsidized goods and so on. What that means now, why am I walking you through this and saying the internet is irrelevant? The internet is powered by disposable income or transactions. So given the lack of disposable income, there is no influence of advertising that will make a difference to them. So nobody advertises to them. Hence, nobody builds an internet for them that matters to them, right? So the economics of the internet is such that it's mathematically provable that nobody will ever build an internet that matters to them unless we think different, right? The good news, now I'll start talking about the good news. The good news is Silicon is starting to think. We are heading into what I like to call the infinity era, which is the era of infinite ideas. And I'm a robotics graduate, like Lakshmi mentioned. And since 1994, when my office mate used to be this crazy guy called Hans Moravec, we have been drawing graphs like this, predicting that around 2025 to 2035, AI or the computer chip will become as powerful as the thinking brain, and we will be able to replicate human intelligence. Now, the original thinking was 2025, except at that time, we had not understood the dendritic density of a single neuron and the nonlinear computations that a neuron was able to do in these dendritic connections. So this 100 trillion connections we have, and the ability to do anywhere from 1 to 5 computations per second in those 100 trillion connections was not obvious, right? Now that it is obvious, that goal has moved from 2025 to 2035. Except the so-called intelligence that we use to do our daily work, about 1.7 billion people who are employed on the planet, most of us don't require a lot of intelligence beyond what our modern computer chips already have. So the $1,000 computer chip, which this graph is based on, is fully capable of automating a large section of our work, what we like to call work, paid work that we do. And that is starting to show in society. So manufacturing jobs are mostly automated, and we are at the fringes of what is not automated, like assembly and so on. And even that is getting systematically automated out. Um, Everybody talks about Foxconn and how many jobs it brings and so on. What is not well, published and talked about widely is that Foxconn has a program to automate approximately 15% of its assembly jobs using robots year over year. And China pays factories in China a $2,000 to $3,000 subsidy anytime they replace a worker with a robot. Now the question, you will ask the question why that is, and the answer is obviously competitiveness, right? And it's not just in the factories, in our households. Automation is slowly starting to creep in. Some of us have these robots which are starting to clean our floors. And some of us even might have this device which makes rotis and other things for you. And the big elephant in the room is automated driving, which is coming our way. And Phoenix has a 100 square mile area where Google is starting to offer autonomous rides, and Tesla is threatening to do the same for all its drivers. Whether or not it's going to happen this year, it's a certainty that it will happen in the next 5 years. And all of you know this. The reason why you get Amazon Prime delivered to you that fast is the moment you order something that is Prime capable, a robot picks it up and takes it to a box to be packaged within a few minutes. There is no human doing that job. And a lot of the low-end restaurants in Japan have autonomous or automated waiters because people are far more expensive than robots, right? And I won't bore you with other examples. All of you know these things. And now people say that, look, these are low-end jobs and menial jobs, and those are going to get automated, and we will move up the value chain like we always have. Fortunately or unfortunately, that is not the case. So when people ask me as a roboticist, which jobs I think will get automated, my answer is that is not the right question. The right question is what percentage of every job will get automated and by when, right? So one of my colleagues and friends is Henrik Christensen. He's the head of AI and robotics in UC San Diego. He's also the head of the AI and robotics roadmap task force in the US. And I went and told him that, look, Henrik, I don't know what you think, but my analysis is that approximately 95% of all the jobs in every vertical will get automated within the next 10 to 15 years. And Henrik looks back at me and says, I think you're being very optimistic in how many jobs will remain, right? And this looks very, it looks very preposterous and something that only, geeks sitting in an ivory tower would say. But it is not preposterous. It is, and the reason why it is not preposterous is, as many of you know, technology is nonlinear, and the human mind does not grasp the exponential curve. When it happens so fast that you wonder what happened, right? I'll give you an example from your own company's history. I have been a big fan of Cisco ever since I was a grad student, and sitting in Carnegie Mellon, we had Cisco routers in our backyard, and most of the East Coast traffic went through our routers, and it was very interesting. Right after lunch, we would see traffic spike, and most of the East Coast traffic would come to a grinding halt. And around that time, John Chambers, who was a new CEO at that time, said something very preposterous. He said phone calls will eventually be free. And this was when I was paying $1.50 to call my parents, and most of us old people remember that era. And people used to wonder, what is he talking about? How can phone calls become free, right? And 2 decades later, it is now obvious, and it has happened, and phone calls are free, and this will come to pass as well. So this example I have here on the upper left is this automated anesthesia machine. And those of you who know anything about medicine know that anesthesia is one of the toughest disciplines. Very few surgeons will do a surgery without having an anesthesiologist they know and trust, because it's one of those things where you have to, monitor approximately 32 parameters, actually 150 parameters. The human brain cannot grasp 150 parameters, so you monitor 32 parameters. And if your too aggressive, the patient might go into coma. If you are too liberal, you might cause pain and cause the patient to wake up. So you have to walk this fine line. And there is a company which has a clinically approved anesthesia machine, which allows you to do automated anesthesia for all except the highest, most riskiest level of anesthesia, level 4. What I'm told by some of those researchers who worked on that is they are actually capable of doing level 4, except they don't know how to convince the people in FDA that it is actually safe to do so, because all the data, they have all the data, but emotionally nobody's willing to accept that it is possible, right? And here are some articles written by bots. You read articles written by bots when you read cricket or when you read financial news every day, but you don't realize it. And you all have seen computer generated art in movies. You have all seen computer generated music in elevators and hotel lobbies, but we don't think it is computer generated. And some of you have seen this data. 69% of Indian jobs are disappearing, and there is evidence all across the board that it is actually happening. Now the question is, why is it so relevant to India? And the final piece of evidence of why this matters to India is that it is actually going to happen in India as fast as it happens in the West. I mean, we are probably going to lag behind 1 or 2 years, but not that much more. I have friends in Chennai who have auto parts manufacturing units who have not increased their workforce from 70 to today. And I have friends who have yarn mills in Delhi, some of my juniors from Carnegie Mellon, who have come and set up yarn mills where every generation, the number of workers is half and the productivity is double, and the cost of the mill is about the same as before, right? And the reason why is the very simple math I have in the bottom right. If you make a robot worth 9 lakhs, and most industrial robots are actually less than that. Even if it's a household robot, even if it's a car, the cost of automating a car, the published cost of automating a car by both Tesla and Google is far less than 9 lakhs. But let's assume upper bound 9 lakhs, which will last for about 7 years. The EMI to cover that is less than 15,000 rupees per month, right? This is less than the salary of anybody you would pay to do any job, menial or otherwise, right? So automation is here to stay, and it is amongst us. And the era we are heading into is called the infinite era. And why I call it the infinite era is very simple. If you have an idea and you bring the idea to life, the ability to manufacture, distribute, and get that idea into everybody's hands is infinity. It's just, marketing and sales and distribution that's required. And as all of us know, marketing, sales, and distribution is also parallelly getting automated. So we will end up in this world where the study of economics will no longer be resources, capital, and labor. The study of economics will be resources, capital, and invention. And the only constrained, entity will be invention. It will not be labor anymore. And this has enormous repercussions. And there are a few companies which have already harnessed this and are starting to, scale exponentially as a result. Cisco is, of course, one of them. And I call all of these singularities. A singularity, in my definition, is a corporation or an enterprise. It can be government also, but a corporation or an enterprise that starts growing at 15 to 20% year over year in the markets that they choose to grow in, even at the size of having a revenue of 50 to $100 billion. And we are now starting to see even so-called old style companies, and this is going to happen to Cisco if it's not happened. Even old style technology companies like Microsoft starting to see that growth curve as soon as they retool themselves. And various older technology companies are in the process of retooling themselves, and the newer ones have already retooled themselves. And you're seeing this enormous growth where they're actually consuming entire categories. Now, whether this is good for the world or not, it's a manifestation of the very same math I showed you earlier, where once you have a high quality invention, scaling it and having it reach every person on the planet is almost frictionless, right? Now, coming back to the problem, 1 billion people are still at the gate, right? All of this is devastating if you take it on face value for 1 billion people, where you will say, now you have a country of 1 billion people who don't have jobs, and you are just walking me through this thesis that jobs are disappearing. How is this good for us? Well, good for us or not, that is a reality, and nothing will change unless we actually confront reality and look at reality and and leverage it for the benefit of the purpose that we are talking about. And here's the first sign, or here's the first data point where it actually starts to tell us that this infinity era that we're heading into is not just the reality, but it's also necessary for India. In many ways, the infinity era is the savior for a country like India. And there was no other way to get development to a country like India in this lifetime. So let me walk you through the math. If we take the ambition of inclusion, which I started the talk with, and turn that into money, how much money will we need to serve India or all 1.3 billion people fully? Now, you can discuss which part of that will be made by the private entities and which of it will be earned by people and which of it will be made by the government. That is, let's set that aside and just look at the data. And the data is that if you take healthcare and you spend the least amount of money that the developed world spends on healthcare, which is UK. UK spends about $3,000 per capita. US spends $12,000, so we'll not go there. But even at spending $3,000 per capita, we will end up spending $4 trillion, right? Administration will cost us 0.3, and law and order, and the reason we have code backlogs is we simply cannot spend enough money to keep law and order up to speed. So we are actually not doing a bad job. Our judges are not doing a bad job. We just don't have enough judges and lawyers, right? Law and order and the police force and so on. Law and order will cost us $8 trillion. Having a financial system that works for everybody, having a bank everybody can walk to, and so on will cost $2 trillion. And education, which is something dear to every Indian, whether poor or rich, to deliver world-class education. And many of you know this reality because you're trying to put your kids through, good schools, will cost us about $3.3 trillion. And I have not, I have talked about soft infrastructure. I have not talked about hard infrastructure, like actually building fiber to every home, which actually happens to be the cheapest thing you can do. I have not talked about having high quality roads and railways and a flight that everybody can take and so on. Even setting all of that aside, the minimum government social manifest is approximately $10.6 trillion. Right? This does not include electricity and water and all of the other things, which is also part of the government manifest. And India's budget is $250 billion. So we are at least, 2 generations away at the growth rates we are going at until we get to the point where we'll have a $10.6 trillion budget. So how do we solve the problem, right? And the answer is, not that hard to look at because I just gave you the answer before I got to that slide. The answer is that if you take the automation era and you start doing inventions which are capable of reducing cost of providing a service from anywhere from 30 to 100 fold, right? And we have seen that happen in the internet. And if you start reducing cost of each of these services and each pieces of infrastructure, including electricity and water and so on, by 30 to 100 fold, within $500 billion, which is double of where India's budget is today, which we will actually get to in the next 8 years, right? With double of India's budget that is there today, we will actually be able to provide the highest quality service in each of these realms and other realms that I did not touch on. So that is a challenge. And I like to call that the terminus effect. So those of you who are science fiction fans, I'm a Isaac Asimov fan. And there is this series he wrote called the Foundation series, where he talks about this planet called Terminus, which is on the outer edges of the galaxy, has no resources. And he sends a bunch of brilliant scientists there. And those scientists figure out how to make technology work without resources. And over time, it becomes the dominant planet or the dominant planet in the entire galaxy. So India, to me, is the terminus of the world, right? We have a bunch of brilliant engineers and scientists who have been educated all over the world who are sitting here. And we have the opportunity to build a system that actually works for all 7.84 billion people, right? The system that we are living in today only works for less than 2 billion people. So we have the opportunity to reinvent every layer of infrastructure. And in doing so, not only will we make the inclusion problem solved, we will also make the companies and the inventions that will come out of that will make India sufficiently wealthy and advanced, where India will actually become a leading nation as a result of that. So is it foregone? Of course, it's not foregone, but there's a very strong likelihood of that happening if we do things right. Now, now there is, putting technology aside, I will now wear my product hat. You have to design the systems that we now build with a different mindset. And I have three rules. One is agency, the other is affordance, and the third is nativance, right? So I will walk you through a couple of examples of my own life. Now I will stop talking about theory and talk about real world examples and walk you through what these things mean. They're very obvious. Most of you probably already know what this is. I'm just going to give them labels. And agency is very simple. Agencies means the idea behind agency is you empower people, right? And so I will talk about my maps journey, where when I moved to India to start Google India, the world was approximately looking like this. We used to make fun of the world map in Google, saying that the world begins somewhere in the Atlantic and somewhere in the Pacific, right? And if you actually looked at the world map, that's exactly how it was, right? And we looked at this problem and said, what do we do? And I happen to have a very simple idea. I don't take credit for the idea because the idea happened by just looking out of the street sitting in Vittal Malia Road. And I saw 4,000 people walking around on the street. And I said, look, if we give the power to the people to map, right? And if one out of these 4,000 people on Vittal Malia Road maps Vittal Malia Road will be mapped. And similarly, there are thousands of people on every street in India. So all you just need to do is to make sure that the infrastructure you create allows them to map, right? And so the three principles that underlie that idea were make it crowdsourced and crowd curated. The second principle was unusual. Even though Wikipedia was live at that time, crowd curation was not something that was in vogue, which is not only do you give the people the ability to map, you also give the people the ability to moderate and make their own decisions about what is right and what is wrong. And of course, disseminate it for each other. And you do all of this real time, right? And I will just show you a quick video, if you can please play the video, of how Madurai, one of the towns in India, got mapped by users when we launched this idea. We turned this idea into code and we launched it. There it is. So this is a video that is spanning approximately, just play it in a loop a couple of times. This spans approximately 3 to 4 months of the Madurai map from when we launched MapMaker. And what is interesting about this was, you would actually, it follows almost, can you just play it again, please? It follows almost exactly the same pattern that you and I would follow when you go to a new city. Initially, you would stick to the, more dense roads, the more, the arterial roads, and then you would then go and explore the more inner parts of the city. And once you're done with the inner part of the city, you start exploring the periphery. So people followed that pattern, not just in Madurai, but in 10,000 cities and towns, and later on in rural India, and the world got mapped. And this story that got repeated in India got repeated in 189 countries, and all of these countries went from having no maps to having a complete map. And impact was far more than we had imagined. We just thought that people will start using these maps for driving directions and finding their home and so on. And then I'll come to the second principle, which is called affordance. And affordance means that you design the invention that you're creating in such a way that people, when people try to use it the way they want to use it, it's available to them. So if you want to create a door, for example, by the way, this is one of my friends, Don Norman's idea called affordance. If you want to create a door where you want people to push the door, you are actually better off not having a handle on the side you want people to push on. People will just push it because there is no handle, right? Having handles on both sides happens to be an aesthetic reason. It's not a good design, right? And if you look at India, right? India is a place where in certain places, people go to the problem doesn't come to them. In certain places, the solution comes to them, they don't go to the solution. So when it comes to ration stores, we are used to going to the ration store. But if you look at the small Kirana stores, the supply comes to them. You will wonder, what am I talking about, right? The supply comes to them. The reason why the supply comes to them is for hundreds of years, people who have run Kirana stores, the suppliers who have been traders, who have been, used to go walk from city to city, used to come to them and sell their wares and go away. Now, if you look at a place like the US, it's the complete reverse. A small store goes to the warehouse, buys things, and comes back, and and they stuff their store. A small store does not have all the supplies that the store needs delivered to them, right? So this idea of affordance is fundamental. So you have to design it the way the society works rather than the way you want, right? And when you do that, enormous impact happens. So when MapMaker went live, there was this very smart woman called Julia in Africa who said, "Hey, I want to map women's atrocities in Kenya." And she succeeded. And she succeeded so widely that this became the platform to map women's atrocities all around the world, right? And then a few years later, George Clooney said, South Sudan is going to succeed. So I'm not going to let what happened in Rwanda happen in South Sudan. Even if the mainstream media does not publish it, I will take every atrocity that happens to people and map it, and then show that data to the mainstream media on a daily basis so that you cannot later say that we didn't know. And the South Sudanese government, when the entire story was done, they came back and said that this is the first peaceful succession in Africa, right? And one of my favorite stories, this is closest to my heart, is that when Pakistan got flooded in 2010, and close to my heart because when I was living in the US, many of my closest friends were Pakistanis, right? And even when I was inside Google, when we were going to launch MapMaker, the most vociferous group were Pakistani engineers. They said, "Look, we do not have any maps at all. Can you launch Pakistan first?" So interestingly, MapMaker was launched in Pakistan first, along with Philippines and so on. India was considered to be a more risky country, so we launched India a few months later. And now, when we launched MapMaker in Pakistan, Pakistani students and expats and the people who had internet connections from Pakistan went nuts and mapped the entire country. It was astonishing to see the entire country was mapped in less than 9 months. And in 2010, Pakistan got flooded. 20% of the country and 10% of the population, 18 million people were displaced. And the UN reached out to us saying, "Look, we don't have any other maps. Can you give us these maps for our disaster management systems?" We, of course, cut out the disputed areas and gave it to them. And they came back to us with this letter you see in front of you, where they said that of the 4.3 million people they were able to get aid to, right? More than 800,000 people would not have received aid, and of them 230,000 lives would not have been saved but for these maps. And when this happened, I took this letter to my wife, and MapMaker was a very, very tough journey for me. I will touch on that in a minute. And I showed it to her, and she said, "This has all been worth it." Right? And I'll come to the final part, which is nativance. And nativance is a very different idea than any design principle you've seen. This is actually a design principle that me and Don Norman have co-created. And the idea behind nativance is that you design the system that you're building, the invention that you're building, to deliberately unlock the capacity that exists in the population already, right? And MapMaker was one such invention where we said, look, there are altruistic people all around the world, and they're waiting for an opportunity to help if you allow them to help their own community. They will not help us because we are Google. They will help us because their own community needs help. And these are pictures of some of the foremost map makers from each of those countries. And one of the young women you see there is a lady from Iran who decided that Iran will get mapped. And it's primarily because of her that Iran got mapped. And the person's photograph, which is highlighted, is a gentleman called CNR Nair, a person from Kerala who spent 4 years mapping all of rural Kerala. And rural Kerala became the first rural region of the entire emerging world to have high quality maps. And the interesting thing was during this time, he knew that he was suffering from cancer. And when he passed away, it was the legacy he left behind. So he himself did 160,000 edits to the map. And he was so enthusiastic that he gathered a whole army of young people who were infected by his enthusiasm, and they came and helped him and did what they did, right? So there is enormous capacity that exists in these, in these 1.35 billion people to help each other and to make things happen for themselves. if you just allow them to do it. And we create systems to do it. So we don't need to help them. We just need to create the tools and platforms to do so. And I will now talk about the personal journey that I went through. And it's only material to talk about this because if any of you takes on a journey like this where you're trying to disrupt a paradigm, right? A paradigm shift is one where you replace a old way of doing things with a new way of doing in a very short period of time, less than 5 to 7 years, right? So if you try to engineer a paradigm shift, there are 2 or 3 realities. One is it is most likely that you as the inventor or the engineer will be the first person to see it. And the second reality is the experts in your own organization, whether you are a startup or a large company like Cisco, the experts who are the experts in that paradigm will most likely oppose you because they will see all the issues that you might have when you try to execute that, right? And very often paradigm shifts die because the experts are prevail over the individual who is not an expert in that area who comes up with this idea, right? And the third simple truth is there is no cavalry. If you don't persist and make it happen, it will not happen. Now, in my own example, when I came up with MapMaker, I was still a junior engineer, right? And the people who were experts in mapping and geospatial in Google said that this is never going to work. It takes 4 years for a GIS expert to become to become somebody who's able to map an area. How are you going to get 10th standard kids and people who are sitting at home and maybe even college kids from other places who have no GIS experience, the ability to map, right? How are you going to solve this problem technically? And then another expert said that even if you allow people to solve this problem technically, maps are so sensitive that if you actually have the wrong road, people will drive off cliffs and people will play mischief with people's restaurants, locations, and so on. And a lot of spam will happen, right? And as a result of this dispute, MapMaker was probably one of the most troubled projects that I ever saw or ever heard of. And the then senior vice president of engineering, Bill Coren, who became a mentor and a friend of mine, said that this was the second hardest problem that he ever dealt with in his life. And the hardest problem was a personal one. And in his work life, he had never seen a more difficult organizational issue to resolve. And long story short, this project was cancelled 7 times, and I was fired 3 times. My director, who was then director, Prasad Ram, he said that it's 4 times you don't know because the 4th time you were not involved. And each time, Larry and Sergey and Eric, or one of those 3, came back and stopped it from happening and allowed the project to continue. So now fighting is one thing, but there are 2 ways of fighting. There are ways of fighting that the world normally knows, and there is a way of fighting where you fight for the cause, but you don't fight the people, right? And fortunately, because of the good teachers I had, I did that. I fought the cause, but I never fought the people who were fighting me. And that Gandhian approach actually seems to work. And the other thing that always seems to work is that, one of my other inspirations, Martin Luther King, there was this poster of his which was on one of the doors in Carnegie Mellon that I used to walk by every day. And that poster used to say that God does not give you a vision without giving you the strength to fulfill it, right? And it's kind of bizarre for those of us who are scientists to actually look at that quote and even ingest it. But for some reason, it turns out to be true. Whether or not it is people understanding your intent and the world coming around to help you, or whatever it might be, it seems to work. So let me talk about a couple of more examples, then I'll stop. More recently, when COVID began, I was called in to help with this project of creating a platform on which people could assess themselves, and people could also, figure out whether they were at risk through Bluetooth tracing. And being engineers and innovators, we went beyond that. And I had this very simple idea where I said, well, let's also start mapping the location of every symptom when it is reported. And then if you actually apply very simple statistical science, the places where the strength of the symptom rise is much higher than the background infection rates. those hotspots are potentially likely places where COVID is emerging. Now, it turns out that when we started correlating that with actual data, it turned out that worked. And this idea was an idea, but the actual computer science was done by, a friend and colleague of mine. Happens to be Lakshmi's husband, Bharadwaj, who was my classmate. Both of us worked on it together and did the CS. And astonishingly, to his credit, within 2 days, he had the algorithm up and running. And another professor from IIT Madras, Kamakoti, worked on the other algorithm of taking the historic location data and fusing the two. And this map you see in front of you was the prediction of infections in that we had in early May, well before North India got highly infected. So we were able to predict that where infections are going to arise well before they arise. And this is one of the tools that has been used by the decision makers. This example is one of Gujarat, where the Ahmedabad government and then later all of Gujarat decided to use this tool very heavily. And they started identifying emerging hotspots well before they happened. And if you look at the world, there's only one place, South Korea, where they have done this, and they have done this with overwhelming workforce, where they would actually do 9,000 tests for every one infected person. Now, India cannot afford that. So we did this with technology. And wherever this was used heavily, it has worked. Right? And the same pattern, by the way, the same pattern repeated, which is the moment you come up with an innovation that is so out of the box that it doesn't make any sense, you will see the people who are experts in that, fight you. And now they are fighting you not because they don't like you or they don't want technology to succeed. The key to remember is that they're fighting you because they also mean well. They're actually trying to do the right thing. They're very afraid that you might be making a mistake at scale. So you have to bring people along and you have to do all the things you do. But the one thing you cannot do is, no matter how hard it is for you, you cannot give up, right? So let me talk about a problem that is not solved. So people think mapping is solved, but only half the maps problem is solved. The original map maker idea was inspired by this Nobel Prize nominee called Hernando de Soto, who said that developing countries are actually sitting on top of all the capital they need. So we struggle as a country to get 150, $200 billion of investment every year. It's not a small amount of money. But the interesting thing is that if you take 40% of India's monetizable land which has an assigned value, either it's agricultural land or commercial land or residential land or government land, just 40% of that adds up to more than $4.5 trillion. And the reason I give you 40% is 40% is the ratio of land in the US, which is under mortgage. So 40% of all US property is mortgaged and used for capital or for incomes or for, to pay forward. And it fuels the economy. That's approximately 18 to $20 trillion of money that fuels and runs the US economy. The US economy would collapse if that was taken out of the equation. Now we are actually struggling because we have never unlocked our largest source of capital. And one of its fundamental needs is, of course, high quality maps. And of course, you need the property boundary itself mapped using a GPS or you having GIS coordinates, which has not happened in most places in the country. And you need the idea of a digital ownership certificate so that you can make land very easily tradable and mortgageable. Which banks, now the reason why banks don't give you mortgage on land very easily is because of these missing pieces. So if we did this, we would unlock $4.5 trillion. And now coming back to reality in terms of what I am working on, I'll give you two examples and then I'll stop. One of the enterprises I'm working on right now is this very small startup called Avanti, where we are trying to reimagine credit and reimagine financial inclusion for both farmers and micro entrepreneurs across rural India, where we are taking the hypothesis that without collateral and without having income, can we give credit to a person purely based on two constructs. One is the community that trusts them using a trust graph we digitize in the community, and their proven ability to execute that livelihood. If they are asking for a loan for 2 buffaloes, if they have a proven ability to milk buffaloes and work on buffaloes over the last 5 years, and the community says, yes, we trust them, we simply give them a loan, right? And the idea here is you build for the 98%, not the 2%. So you build for the 98% of the world's population who is completely trustworthy. Most people don't wake up saying, how do I cheat people? There are 2% who wake up saying, how do I cheat and how do I make money on the sly and how do I do shortcuts? And if you figure out how to, carve out those 2% and create barriers to entry for those 2%, but you trust the other 98%, we believe this will happen. We are seeing some extraordinary numbers where when the credit bureaus say that you cannot trust this person, that you will lose money, and historically people who have lent to people like that are losing money, we are actually seeing them paying back, and not just paying back. Partly we are paying them. We are seeing more than 98% of that money coming back. I'm not surprised, but a lot of people are surprised. By the way, there's an underlying bias in all of my examples. And the underlying bias is that I completely trust humanity. I think humanity is not given enough credit. We have become very cynical because of the few examples, bad examples we see. And I think, and I like to say that one of the reasons why a poor person is poor is because they have decided not to cheat and pillage, right? If they were, if they were inclined to cheat, they'd probably not be as poor as they are. So for all the more reason that the poorer a person is, the more likely that if you trust them, they will do the right thing, right? And the second one, the second startup, which is even harder to do, is a company of mine I founded, which in about 2016. And this is about making communities computable. So one of the constructs that I have seen in my journey is that people by themselves don't have sufficient power, but as a community, they have far more happiness and they have far more power. Now, I don't have to give many examples outside our own lives. If you look at your own life, you're happiest when you're with a community that you have identified with. You're happiest in your apartment complex. You're happiest when you're in your extended family and so on. So communities, really work. Not only do they work in India, and India has a history of, small villages and communities working together, but actually the same thing applies around the world. The problem is nobody has built computing platforms for communities. So we are trying to reimagine what computer science would look like if you make communities computable. And our mission is to bring an end to poverty subsidizing the world, right? People think this is a typo. It's not a typo. I do mean bringing an end to poverty subsidizing the world. Poverty is why we have food at the rates we have, and why we get clothes for $5 when actually it should cost $15 or $20, and so on. And along the way, there are middlemen who obviously are making themselves wealthy on the backs of the poorest. And one way to accept this is to actually provide agency, affordance, and nativance to communities. And we hope to do that. This is a very hard computer science problem, but if you're interested, I'm happy to talk to you about this separately. So with that, I will end. And those of you who grew up in India, I would like to remind you that this idea of, Sare Jahan Se Acha is not about making India the strongest or the most wealthiest. And I think there is a role for a nation to build infrastructure which will succeed worldwide, where we bring the idea of inclusion to the entire world. And I believe that in this infinity era, with the whole world becoming networked and the computing chip becoming self-aware and starting to become intelligent, I think the whole body of innovations can happen, which will bring inclusion and which will bring a system that works for all 7.8 billion of us. And I can't wait to see what some of the younger engineers among you bring to life in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lalitesh. I hope you can hear the virtual applause. We have been getting amazing comments. There are about 900 people listening to you. And some of the comments are, he's such a cool geek, such an eye-opener. It's that amazing insight, so logical, brilliant session. I can go on. And there are a lot of questions as well, right? So let me start by asking, in the order in which they came in. One is, do you believe that the government regulation will or can slow down the speed of automation?
They will. So government regulations not will. The government regulations are slowing down the speed of automation, certainly in India, but around the world. Actually, one of the reasons why um, continuously the people who have said automation is going to happen have been wrong a little bit, off by 5 years to 10 years, is because regulation is in the way. But there comes a point, the tipping point is when the automation solution is 3 to 6 times cheaper or faster than the alternative. You cannot stop it. So it will happen. And see, the thing is, we always complain about regulation. There's a lot of regulation in India. I'm the first person to say there's a lot of regulation in India that needs to get cleaned up. But also, when you are governing and having a society function at scale, the scale especially that India is, right, and the complexity that we have, where we want to make sure that we do no harm, right? Changing regulation requires a lot of help and requires a lot of due care. It has to be done carefully, but it does have to be done. And and I will always turn a question back to the person who asked the question, because if this is bothering you, you can do something about it. And I have seen a lot of willingness in the government to listen. Now, they will not listen to everything you say, but if you are if you're able to use all your technical knowledge and help try to improve regulation, there are people willing to listen.
Right. So when you talk about building for scale, right, as an engineer, how should somebody think differently? I mean, what do I learn? What do I unlearn, maybe, in particular?
Yeah. So I will quote Steve Jobs and say you have to be clear about what not to do. So see, this does not come naturally to me, or I don't think it comes naturally to anybody. Nobody is born figuring out how a billion node network works, right? And I think it requires two things. One is it requires your willingness to learn, right, in any direction, right? And Lakshmi, you're giving me examples of what you do about these. How do you make a network secure in a world where MAC addresses don't exist, or MAC addresses are agile, right? So there's a lot of learning you have to do when you solve problems like this, and this is definitely not stuff that I would have learned or you would have learned in school. So you have to be a lifelong learner. And the other key thing, so there are a lot of us who are lifelong learners, but there is one key discipline that you need, which is the hardest. And it's very, very simple. Whenever you are designing and your intention is to design for scale, the simplest principle is do not do anything that does not scale. Right? Even if it takes you, even if the answer means that you don't have an answer. So you sit there until you find a solution, but you do not do it because you want to do something next quarter. And if you do that, if you do that, I believe that most people I'm addressing are smart enough that you can design for scale. There's no magic to it.
Thank you. So continuing on that, one question was, 1 minute, maybe I'll get back to that. But you said your project got cancelled 7 times, you got fired 3 times or 4. Yeah. What kept you going, and how did you kind of have people work with you and go on?
Yeah. So I think the first time the project got cancelled is when I went through hell. So I thought the hardest thing I was ever going to do was to do a startup, and my startup was acquired by Google. But about a year and a half before it was acquired by Google, I remember this one evening where I realized that we don't have payroll, and we have not made payroll for the last 2 months, and I have no idea how I'm going to make payroll. Unfortunately, it was only like 7 engineers, all very close friends of mine. And I went back to the office in the middle of the night, sat in the office on the floor, and tried to figure out what to do. Right. Thankfully, the team did not desert me, and we somehow made the product successful to the point where Google bought us. And I thought that was the hardest thing I was going to do. Right. That was nowhere close to the hardest thing I had to do. The hardest thing I had to do was to let go of my own notion of my self-image when the first time this project was cancelled. So here I was, known outside Google as the founder of Google India, and with whatever titles and so on bring. And fortunately, Larry and Sergey were generous enough when we got acquired that I didn't have to work for a living. And so the easiest thing for me when the first time the project got cancelled was for me to leave, right? and join another company, and get a title and do whatever else you can do. This is the usual corporate rollout. It's very easy to do for an exec. Those of you in the senior management know what I'm talking about. And I decided to do the opposite. I decided to, not worry about my title, actually turn back into a engineer who only codes. And I said that, they can take the team away from me, which is what happened at that time. And, but they cannot stop me from coding. And the reason was that this book by Hernando de Soto was burnt in my mind. And I said, look, if what he says seems to be true and all the math that he's done seems to be true, and if there is a chance that building a map for the emerging world will have that kind of impact, billions of dollars and millions of lives will be positively affected. I'm going to do it until somebody does a better job. So if somebody and Google had started a parallel project by that time, but they were never able to succeed because they did it out of Mountain View. Sitting in Mountain View or Santa Clara, you will never understand the problems in India. So they never succeeded. But I said, if they do a better job, I will back off and I'll walk away. But until somebody solves this problem, I'm not going to stop. And it is not about me anymore. And by the way, interestingly, one of the inspirations of this was John Chambers. I don't know if those of you who were in Cisco in 1997, 98, people used to ask John Chambers, how do you govern? How do you, manage Cisco? And he used to say that every decision I make thinking what is good for Cisco. I do not bring myself into the picture. He must have already, this must be mantra inside Cisco. And I was, struck because coming from an academic world, that was never true. People always worried about themselves as well as the mission. Nobody just went to work saying, I'm only going to worry about the mission, right? So I took inspiration from that and said, instead of worrying about, until then it was all about Google because I had internalized this and everything I did was for Google. And I said, from now on, everything I do will be for the people. And as long as those people are being served and until somebody else serves them better, I will continue. Right. So it's a long answer, but it's a very important thing because it's not something you're taught in school. And it's very theoretical until it happens to you. So you only know what you're made of when it happens to you, and it's a choice you have to make. So that's what kept me going. And later on, what happened is what Martin Luther King said came true. People kind of came out of the woodwork and started helping me, even though it was not their day job to help me. And then it took off. And the rest is a happy story. But that year and a half was the hardest in my life.
Right. Actually, I wanted to ask you that you talked about Martin Luther King and then the vision, right? Not everybody has a vision. You did, and people kind of followed you. So how do you make that happen? How do you convince people or have them believe the same vision that you have?
I don't know, Lakshmi. People just do. I don't try to convince them.
I guess they just see you and they are inspired, or they just also start.
No,
I don't know.
No, see, I had the good fortune of working with visionaries all my life, right? My granduncle was one of them, and my dad was one of them. And when I went to the US, I always gravitated towards advisors who were known to be visionaries, right? Whether it was Raj Reddy and Red Whittaker in CMU or Mark Rutkowski in Stanford and so on. What I found very interesting is they don't try to convince. And I sort of learned, they just do. Like Gandhiji used to say, be the change. So you just be the change and you do, you be the geek, right? In my case, I'm a geek, so you be the geek. The only thing I can do is be a geek, so you just be a geek. And you be laser focused on doing what you do. And the key thing is, and this is the hardest part, the key thing is, when trouble happens, you don't fight the people. You fight for the cause, but don't fight the people. It's very easy to confuse the two. So you said something that, I would like to address, Lakshmi. Most people don't have vision. That's not actually true. So if you sit quiet and listen, you will hear a lot of chatter in your brain. People call that meditation, right? And if you wait long enough for the chatter to subside, there'll be a much more gentler, kinder voice inside you, which will actually say something, which is your vision. Right? And everybody has one, except we have learned to ignore it, and we have been taught since we were kids to ignore that. In the guise of practicality, our parents have and our grandparents have drilled it into us to ignore what is our natural vision, and all of us have it, right? And Isaac Asimov used to say that if we let go of that noise in our head and connect with each other the way we exactly are, we have minds made for the stars. And I have found that to be true, because when I have worked in that mode, I'm not always like this, because if you talk to my wife, she's not very happy with most of the time the way I behave around the house and so on. But when the times when I'm focused like that, and you see that in cricketers, like when Tendulkar or Kohli focuses like that, the world aligns around you, right? And it is within all of us to find that zone and be who we are meant to be. And it is what it takes is courage, because I mean, Steve Jobs used to say, right, follow your curiosity. It's very easy to say that, but it's very hard to do, because following your curiosity means you have to let go of a lot of things that you're attached to.
Right. Yes, lot of the noise, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But inspiring to know that it's there in us. It's just us to get it out. Yeah. Coming back to Asimov, so who will be our Hari Seldon and the foundation who will go and create Terminus?
Well, I think I would ask the question. I would ask the person who asked the question, why not you? Harry Seldon was not an extraordinary person, right? He was just stubborn and bold.
Right. Yeah.
That's all we need to be.
I guess the one. True. Nicely said. One question was, the examples you shared are philanthropical, right? What experiences and instances in your life made you think on this line rather than the business? When did that switchover happen? Was it gradual? Was it like a tipping point? What was it?
It's the wrong question. The reason I'm pausing is I would rephrase the question. The examples I gave seem to be philanthropic. There is nothing philanthropic about Maps. Maps is now making more than $2 billion for Google. Nobody told me, that's my rough estimate. I think they're making $250 million in India and probably $2 to $3 billion around the world. And that map is going to become so mission critical when Waymo goes live that Google will make $10 to $20 billion from that. So there was nothing philanthropic about Maps. There is an altruistic side, right? So let me give you my formula. I think there's a better way to do it. Imagine a Venn diagram of all the problems in the world that you need to solve, right? Now create a circle of all the problems that can be solved at scale. And I think it's a, lack of imagination that will make you think that everything cannot be scaled. I think everything can be scaled, right? With the exception of things which you should not scale because it will, damage the planet and so on, right? So take all the problems that can be solved at scale. Now add another circle of all the problems, if you solve at scale, are good for your organization. And the organization can be you as a personal person, your mission, or it can be Google, or it can be Cisco, or it can be the government of India, right? You take all of them and you take the intersection of the two. What can be done at scale and what is good for your organization. And the third thing is take all the things which, if solved at scale, is good for society. Right? If you take the intersection of these three, right, it turns out it's a non-zero set. How big that set is, I do not know, but I have not found a limit to it yet. Right now, there are examples. Now let me give you examples. So Maps was one example. Arogya Setu is one example, and both the last examples I gave you. Now we have not reached scale yet, so we'll have to wait for 10 years to have this conversation. But both Indihood and Avanti are for-profit companies, and both are examples. I think it's a failure of imagination that we think that for-profit means that we cannot do good for society. Now, it requires discipline. Actually, the opposite is true. It requires discipline to remain, society-focused and, make sure that your mission does not waver from society when you become profitable. You will eventually become profitable if you're stubborn. And other examples which are, out there, everybody talks about Elon Musk. And if you look at what he's doing very closely, he opens his architecture. He freely talks about what he's doing, but he doesn't stop. And everything he's building is designed to work at scale and to be good for society, right? So you don't have to look very. I mean, I think it's a false dichotomy. And primarily, by the way, I was Um, I was victim to the same philosophy until my eyes got opened. Primarily because of at least our education in India and education around the world, that for-profit means greed and philanthropy means charity. You can actually harness and combine the two.
Interesting. I question is that you were able to work on a project like this with Google. Many of us work in areas like networking and things like that. What advice do you give us to contribute to that intersection of, solving societal problems, being in the corporate? I think that was
the same answer I gave before. Refuse to work on anything else. Just see, if you're serious about working on stuff at scale and working on stuff that is good for society, right? If you're a product leader or a engineering leader, reimagine what you're doing. And if you're an engineer on that team, come up with an idea and be stubborn.
Yeah.
It's quite simple.
And then one more question that came up is, how does climate change and affect change your model, the model that you initially showed, right? Does that have an impact at all?
It does. So, see, the infinity era gives us great power. And I mean, both us as technologists and us as policymakers and us as, leadership and just human beings on the planet. And it requires us to have a new discipline that we never had before, which is to make sure almost everything we do is a net positive for the environment as we know it versus a net negative. And interestingly, the infinity era, creates potential fears of a Blade Runner future where we will actually have a scorched planet, right? But if you look very closely, that is just fiction. But if you look very closely, it's actually more economical to do what is green. So I talked about electricity. It's actually going to be cheaper to have an electrical infrastructure, which is planet scale and greener for society, right? So I think the infinite era will unlock a whole bunch of innovations where this either or will go away. Now we have to change our habits. There is no known math where all 7.8 billion people can have a car, right? That's not going to work. It's mathematical reality. So we have to reimagine public transport and infrastructure which actually works and which is as convenient as a car, which is doable. And you have beginnings of that with Hyperloop and so on, right? But it is possible and it's imaginable, but we have to work at it.
Yeah, makes sense. One question about the maps is, how are the maps being validated for accuracy? Are there people dedicated to do this?
That's a very good question. So let me talk about the technology behind MapMaker. There were three pieces of technology that were non-obvious. One is when the user does a gesture. So when you're drawing on the map, you're actually not drawing the exact GIS coordinates. You're doing a gesture on top of satellite imagery. To transform the gesture into a set of map graph elements, because the map is a graph, right? It has nodes and it has edges and so on. So you have to transform them into these map elements. You have to align the geometry and you have to figure all of that out. There's a field called computational geometry, which roboticists love. So I brought that field into this realm and applied that rigorously. So that was one. And the other one was the UX. How do you make the UI so interesting and useful that people will be inclined to map, right? You have to make it exciting and gamified and so on and so forth. It was much harder in those days because it was the early days of JavaScript, and I had my colleagues. So the story of the first year and a half of Maps was two people: me writing the entire server, and my friend and colleague Sanjay Jain writing the entire JavaScript interface, right? Which was very, very hard in those days. Because it was early days and we had to solve that problem. The third problem, which was the question you asked, is the how do you trust? So the question you're asking, if I can rephrase, is how do you trust an input that is given, right? And who approves it, right? And and that was built with 3 layers. So one was the moment that piece of data comes in, you start gathering signals about it. So I had built a signal vector of approximately 250 signals, both regional, geometric, local, and all kinds of signals, which were computed the moment it came in. So the edits, we call them edits, as the map edits flowed in, the first wave of validating the machine was done by, like the person who asked the question was done by a core team of mapping experts sitting in Hyderabad, our operations office, right? And this was initially about 15 people, and it grew to around 80 people. It never grew higher than 80 people for the entire developing world, right? All 189 countries. This team remained less than 80 people.
But what did they compare it against, though?
Yeah. So I'm getting to that. And then what the other thing we had done was, when MapMaker went live, this was the first crowdsourced product where you could edit and moderate. So everybody was an editor and everybody was a moderator, right? Except you didn't know who to trust on day zero.
Yes.
So what these 80 people did was to seed the trust network. Once you seed the trust network, that a trust network that is built for convergence, right, converges very rapidly. Right. So you
Right.
had this graph of trust, and based on the activity of the people in where each person was a node, and based on the activity that was emanating from the people, and based on these 250 signals we are gathering per edit, right? We did a it's actually a new field of machine learning I call sparse learning, right? Coming from CMU, I was trained very deeply in deep learning, and neural nets was my bread and butter. Except I realized neural nets will not work here because you have very sparse amount of data about people who are never going to give you large amounts of data. The highest we saw was 160,000 edits from a person, but most people did less than 10-20 edits, right? So we used a model-based learning system which allowed us to converge very rapidly with sparse learning, and that was the secret sauce behind how we got this. And so the way when we launched in a country, so I'll give you the data. When we launched in a country, all the edits had to be moderated by people, right? Which was the internal moderation team, who were backing up the crowd moderators. And within 6 to 8 months, 80% of all the edits were now going live automatically, because the learning algorithm had learned enough confidence that it started trusting which edits could go live automatically. And of the 20% that remained, more than half of them were moderated by the community themselves, and less than 6 or 7% had to be still moderated by the core team.
Cool. Wow. The other question is, how do we make internet relevant to the 1 billion in India? What types of skills and training of the 1 billion are required to support the interventions like Avanti and Indihood? How can this market be created?
So I'll go back to the idea of agency, affordance, and nativance. Right? If you design with those 3 principles, you don't need to do any training. You just need to create the platform and introduce it to them. And so I'll give you an example of Avanti. We have Avanti being used by our partners. It's actually on our website. So 2 of our partners I'm most fond of are the Women of Seva in Gujarat, and this organization called Asefa, created by this amazing person called Anachi, who was a disciple of Vinoba Bhave, right? And these are, societal scale organizations. Seva addresses more than, I think, 5 or 7 million women, and Asefa has a footprint of 2 million households, right? When we go live in one of the Seva districts or Asefa districts, our training time is less than 2 days. And most of the training time is not done in person. We do remote training, and we just walk people through. It's mostly for reassurance. They actually do most of the work. We just reassure them that what they're doing is right. And once we train 1 or 2 of them, they train each other. And our rule of thumb is that if you're doing if it is more than, for example, let's suppose you bought an Xbox for your friend or your kid, and if you have to spend more than 15 minutes walking them through it, something is wrong with the product, right?
Right.
And I would give you the hypothesis that the products for the next next billion people is no different. If it requires more than 5-10 minutes of exposure, and that exposure should be done by a friend of theirs, not you or me. If you are able to do that, and it's very doable, then it'll scale by itself.
Great. This is a nice question. What are some of your favorite tools for learning, and how do you go about learning new things?
Well, there is no substitute for books. And
Right.
I'm old-fashioned. I still read books printed on paper. Unfortunately, I cannot take a laptop and flip back and forth between 4 different pages, which I like to do.
Right.
There's no substitute for books. At the same time, I'm opportunistic, so I read very heavily on the internet as well and follow innovations as and when they happen. And I think that the final thing is, I have my area of madness, right? My area of madness is robotics and computing, right?
Mm.
So if you came to my house and you were even halfway technical, I would bore you with this new ARM architecture that Apple is coming out, and the new ARM architecture that AWS, it's called, I think, called the Nitro architecture or something, has released, and how the depth of the queue is far more important than the sophistication of the instruction set, and why because of the L1, L2, L3 layer being backed by storage systems like Optane, all of distributed computing is going to be redone in the next 3 years and has to be rewritten. So I stay on the bleeding edge by just reading from the brightest people in the industry, not a surprise. But I have my area of madness, and I spend a lot of time in my area of madness.
Nice. I know you like Foundation series. What are your other favorite books? Maybe the latest few or something.
The others are my 2 favorite authors, and this shows my age. My 2 favorite authors were Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. And I happen to like the Indian epic of Mahabharata. My grandmother actually was a maestro in that area, and when I was the age of 3, she started that story, and she would tell me that story 3 hours a day. And from the age of 3 to the age of 6, so 3 years, every day, 3 hours a day is how long she took me to tell the entire epic, and she knew everything by heart, right? So those 3, I think, are my probably all-time favorites. And as far as non-science fiction is concerned, the usual stuff like Ludlum and Agatha Christie and so on.
Oh,
and the rest of it is opportunity.
But one question, a little different, is what are your thoughts on and opinions about our standard education system versus innovation schools? In that context, what's the way forward for a nation to accelerate invention?
It's a very good question. The problem is not just the nation. I think the entire world needs to retool education, right? And some people, especially the professors from Singularity University, have said that. And I fully agree with that. Now, what is the answer? Nobody knows. I think we have to do a lot of trials and figure it out. I have my own bias. I think one way that India can, lead in education again is by going back to a community-led education model, using a combination of Montessori and community leaders, not community leaders as in the political leaders, but community leaders who are well-read and well-educated, kind of helping their own community get educated. And that is one of the things that Indihood hopes to solve, but we will see whether that succeeds or not. But having said that, I think education has to be reimagined at every level, including at the university level. Some universities are starting to do it, but I think everybody knows, including people who are in academia, that we are not able to do it fast enough, right? So I'll give Bharadwaj's example because I am in touch with what he's doing. He's trying to reimagine how you actually build education around projects of telerobotics, right? And actually work on leading edge projects and make that your fulcrum of education versus classroom teaching, right? And this has been successfully done in some pockets around the world, but I think this is going to be the mainstream of education, where you work on things and you learn along the way versus just getting bookish stuff, because the boundaries of disciplines are blurring. And I have this, for example, I have this phrase called barn. So one of my dreams is to want to start a university when I retire, or retire the second time.
Nice.
And my idea of barn is are the 4 fields that are going to drive the 21st century. So B stands for biology, A is for astro, and R is for robo, and N is for nano, right? I believe these are the 4 technologies that will drive most of innovation in the 21st century. Now, if you are going to educate a kid, right, Now, obviously, you have to learn the basics, but once you start getting beyond the 9th or 10th grade, right, the answer cannot be that I teach them subjects in all 4 areas, right? The answer has to be you expose them to all of them and let them find an area of madness that they love to go deep into, whether it be computing architecture or nanomaterials or applied physics or molecular genomics, whatever it might be, right? Let them follow that while they're aware and have sufficient tools in the other areas, so they're not caught blindsided, right? So we can keep going on and on about education, but I think the only thing we are doing wrong is not innovate. If we keep innovating, I think we'll find it.
Great. One more question is, which will be the most valuable organizations in the next 50 years? I guess they mean in what field, or
I just
or
told
I
you the
don't know
4
whether
fields.
they want to invest off. Yeah.
So these are the 4 fields that will matter, but not every company in each of those fields will succeed unless they have a invention DNA. So see, in the previous era, in the 90s, for example, when a company became large and mature, it started buying innovation instead of doing innovation, right? And companies are now starting to realize that you cannot outsource innovation anymore to M&A. You actually have to bring innovation in the house and make it the primary thing you do, because all the other functions of an organization, which was synthesis, combining products and distributing it and scaling it, are going to be so easy to do that it won't matter unless you have an innovation engine in-house, right? So as long as you have an innovation engine in-house and you work in one of these areas, or you take an existing area and you apply one of these areas, I think the sky's the limit.
Great, thank you. Amazing. I have this notebook here with so many notes, and I think I have to go over it again. But so many things to take back from this talk. It's just been amazing to find your vision, to keep innovating, and so many more questions also. Sadly, not enough time. But I do want to thank you, and I'm sure you've inspired everyone like you have inspired me. And I would like to ask our VP of Engineering, Krishna, to have say a few words and close.
Thank you for your very thoughtful questions, Lakshmi.
Thank you.
Lakshmi, thank you.
Thanks to everyone, actually.
Lakshmi, thanks a lot for stepping in and moderating. Lalitesh, amazing. What an inspiring talk. I think you touched upon country view, corporate view, which I think many of the folks grapple with. I think the question that the Venn diagram that you mentioned is the problem that many people grapple with, and you answered it very eloquently. It's amazing in the way you answered it and made it simple for people. What you've done is phenomenal for the country, and you've made us all proud in doing the stuff that you've been doing. I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart and wish you all the very best. We have a lot of learnings to do. As Lakshmi mentioned, I still need to collate a lot of the thoughts that have come through. Building for scale, which is a problem. What is simple enough? I think you mentioned about it, right? How will the rural take products? The next billion people, when they take a product, what are they going to do? If you need more than 10 minutes to teach them, I think the product is dead on arrival. All of those are very, very relevant for us in the way it matters to what we do daily basis inside. Lot of learnings for us. Thanks a lot. You've been a treasure
Krishna,
for us.
One thing. There was one feedback I don't want him to not know about. It says, I'm refreshed for another year at this point. This is inspiration personified.
Absolutely.
Love this comment. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I was going to say that I think there's a lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts that have come in through, which we can take it. And I'm refreshed, I'm inspired. Same is true with a lot of the folks on the call. Really appreciate you coming on and talking to us and sharing your journey. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Krishna. Very kind words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.